I'm Jade, 18, and the moment I walked into that conference room wearing my best interview suit, I saw my brother's face drain of all color. He was sitting in the waiting area, probably rehearsing answers to questions about an internship he thought was guaranteed, while I sat on the other side of the table as the youngest member of the selection panel. 6 months earlier, my parents had taken my $47,000 college fund to pay off his drug debts, promising he'd finally get his life together. Now, as he stared at me through the glass partition, I realized that sometimes the best revenge is simply being better than the person who thought they deserved your opportunities. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Growing up in the Chen household meant understanding that perfection was the baseline, not the goal. My parents immigrated from Taiwan in the 1980s with nothing but advanced degrees and an unshakable belief that success in America required flawless execution of every opportunity. They built their lives around the principle that hard work would eventually translate into the American dream, and they expected their children to inherit both their work ethic and their unwavering commitment to excellence. My older brother Derek had always been the chosen one, the golden child who could do no wrong even when he was clearly doing everything wrong. 2 years older than me, Derek possessed the kind of natural charisma that made teachers overlook his missing assignments and parents excuse his increasingly erratic behavior. While I spent my high school years maintaining a 4.0 GPA, working 20 hours a week at a local tutoring center, and carefully saving every dollar for college, Derek coasted through his classes on charm and promises he never intended to keep. The signs of Derek's drug problem had been obvious to everyone except our parents, who seemed determined to interpret his bloodshot eyes and dramatic mood swings as evidence of artistic temperament rather than substance abuse. When Derek started disappearing for days at a time during his senior year of high school, my parents convinced themselves he was staying late at school working on creative projects. When he began stealing money from my mother's purse, they rationalized it as temporary borrowing for school supplies he was too embarrassed to ask for directly. I watched this willful blindness with the kind of frustration that builds slowly over time, accumulating like sediment until it becomes impossible to ignore. Every excuse my parents made for Derek felt like a small betrayal of the standards they held me to. A reminder that love in our household was conditional on maintaining the fiction that we were a perfect family with perfect children who would achieve perfect success through perfect effort. My college fund had been growing steadily since I was 12, fed by birthday money, holiday gifts, and wages from part-time jobs that I had taken specifically to reduce the financial burden on my parents. $47,000 represented 6 years of sacrifice, 6 years of choosing work over social activities, 6 years of carefully tracking every expense and celebrating every deposit like a small ball. Victory in my campaign for independence. The money sat in a joint account that required both my signature and my parents' signature for withdrawals, a safety measure that my father had insisted on when I first opened the account. At the time, I had appreciated his caution, understanding that it protected my savings from impulsive spending decisions I might regret later. I never imagined that the account structure would eventually protect my money from me while leaving it vulnerable to my parents' desperation. The internship Derek had been groomed for since sophomore year was with Henderson and Associates, a prestigious consulting firm that specialized in international business development. My father had cultivated a relationship with James Henderson through their shared involvement in the Asian American Business Association, carefully nurturing a professional friendship that he hoped would eventually translate into opportunities for his children. For 3 years, my parents had shaped Derek's academic and extracurricular activities around the goal of impressing Henderson and Associates. They encouraged him to take Mandarin classes to demonstrate his multicultural competency, pushed him toward economics and business courses that would show his practical understanding of the corporate world, and arranged volunteer opportunities with organizations that served the Asian American community. Derek's entire high school career had been a carefully orchestrated performance designed to culminate in an internship offer that would launch his career in international business. The irony was that I had always been more interested in business and economics than Derek, who preferred creative writing and had talked vaguely about becoming a filmmaker before his drug problem derailed any meaningful career planning. While Derek struggled through his required business courses, I had been devouring books about international trade, studying successful Asian American entrepreneurs, and developing a genuine passion for the kind of cross-cultural business development that Henderson and Associates specialized in. But in my parents' minds, the internship belonged to Derek by virtue of his birth order and gender, assumptions that they never explicitly stated, but that shaped every decision they made about our respective futures. I was expected to excel academically as a matter of course, but my achievements were seen as stepping stones toward a stable career in medicine or engineering, rather than launching pads for the kind of high-profile business success they envisioned for Derek. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Thursday evening in late July, just 3 weeks before I was supposed to move into my dorm room at Northwestern University. I had spent the day shopping for bedding and school supplies, excited about finally starting the college experience I had been working toward for years. My acceptance to Northwestern's business program felt like validation of all the sacrifices I had made, proof that my careful planning and relentless effort had paid off in exactly the way I had hoped. My parents called me into the living room after dinner with the kind of serious expressions that usually preceded discussions about major family decisions. I assumed they wanted to talk about logistics for my move to campus, maybe review the course schedule I had finalized earlier that week, or discuss how frequently I should call home during my first semester away. Instead, my mother sat on the edge of the couch, wringing her hands in the way she did when she was preparing to deliver bad news, while my father stood by the window with his back to me, staring out at our perfectly manicured front yard, as if the grass might provide him with the words he needed for whatever he was about to say. "Jade," my mother began, her voice carrying the kind of forced calm that adults use when they're trying to minimize the impact of devastating information. "We need to talk to you about your college fund." The past tense of her statement registered immediately, sending a cold spike of fear through my chest that made it difficult to breathe normally. "What about my college fund?" I asked, though some part of me already knew that whatever came next would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my carefully planned future. My father turned around slowly, his face wearing the expression of someone who had already convinced himself that his actions were justified by circumstances beyond his control. "Derek got into some trouble," he said, as if this explanation would somehow make whatever followed more palatable. "He borrowed money from some dangerous people, and they were threatening him. We had to help him." The euphemisms hit me like physical blows. Derek hadn't borrowed money from dangerous people. He had racked up drug debts with dealers who were now demanding payment with interest. My parents hadn't had to help him. They had chosen to prioritize his immediate crisis over my long-term educational goals, sacrificing my future to clean up the mess he had made of his present. "How much?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "All of it," my mother whispered, tears streaming down her face in a display of emotion that felt manipulative rather than genuine. "We're so sorry, Jade. We'll find another way to pay for college. Derek is going to get clean, and he'll pay us back. He promised." The naivety of their belief in Derek's promises would have been laughable if it hadn't been so personally devastating. Derek had been making promises about getting clean for 2 years. Elaborate commitments that lasted exactly as long as it took for the immediate crisis to pass before he resumed the same destructive patterns that had created the crisis in the first place. I sat in that living room, listening to my parents explain how they had liquidated my college fund to pay off drug dealers, and felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of my place in our family. Hierarchy. The money I had saved through years of sacrifice had been treated as an emergency resource for Derek's problems, available for redistribution whenever his poor choices created financial pressure that threatened the PRID. Family stability. The $47,000 was gone, transferred to people whose names my parents didn't even know, used to purchase Derek's temporary safety from consequences he had brought on himself through months of stress. increasingly reckless behavior. 6 years of careful saving, 6 years of choosing work over fun, 6 years of planning for a future that my parents had just traded away for Derek's immediate convenience. "Northwestern will work with us on a payment plan," my father said, his voice carrying the kind of false confidence that suggested he hadn't actually spoken to anyone at Northwestern about payment plans. "You'll still be able to go to college. It just might take a little longer to pay off." The casual way he dismissed the financial reality of my situation revealed how completely he misunderstood both the cost of college and the impact of debt on young people trying to build careers. Northwestern's tuition alone was over $50,000 per year, an amount that would require massive student loans even with the college fund I no longer had. Adding room and board, books, and living expenses would push my total debt well over $200,000 by graduation, a burden that would shape every career decision I made for decades. But beyond the financial implications, what devastated me most was the casual way my parents had disposed of my agency in determining my own future. They had made a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my life without consulting me, treating my college fund as their money to deploy however they saw fit, rather than recognizing it as the product of my labor. And planning. I excused myself from that conversation and went to my room, where I spent the night staring at the ceiling and trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. My carefully planned future had been sacrificed to enable Derek's continued irresponsibility, and my parents seemed to expect gratitude for their promise to eventually find alternative solutions to problems they had created. By morning, I had made a decision that felt both impulsive and inevitable. If Derek was going to benefit from my sacrifice, then I was going to pursue the opportunities that had been designated for him. The Henderson & Associates internship that my parents had spent 3 years preparing him for was exactly the kind of experience that could launch a career in international business, and I was better qualified for it than Derek had ever been. I had been following Henderson & Associates since my sophomore year of high school, reading their published research reports and tracking their major client announcements with the kind of obsessive attention that Derek had never shown toward anything except his next high. I understood their business model, knew the names of their senior partners, and had a genuine passion for the cross-cultural business development that formed the core of their practice. More importantly, I had the academic credentials and work experience that Derek lacked. My 4.0 GPA was accompanied by advanced placement scores in economics and calculus, leadership positions in business-oriented student organizations, and fluency in Mandarin that exceeded Derek's despite his years of formal study. If Henderson & Associates were looking for a promising young intern, I was objectively a stronger candidate than my brother. The application deadline for the Henderson & Associates internship program had passed months earlier, during the spring semester when Derek was supposed to submit his materials. But I had been tracking the company's recruitment activities, and I knew they occasionally accepted late applications from exceptional candidates who could demonstrate compelling reasons for missing the standard deadline. I spent the weekend crafting an application that was simultaneously honest about my delayed submission and strategically silent about my family circumstances. I explained that I had recently decided to pursue business rather than pre-med, a pivot that had occurred too late in the academic year to meet standard internship deadlines, but that reflected a genuine shift in my career interests based on courses and experiences that had crystallized my braw. Professional goals. My essay focused on my passion for cross-cultural business development, drawing on my experience tutoring recent immigrants in English and mathematics while learning about their struggles to navigate American business customs and educational systems. I wrote about my interest in helping companies expand into Asian markets while maintaining sensitivity to cultural differences that could make or break international partnerships. The letter of recommendation I needed came from Mrs. Rodriguez, my AP economics teacher, who had been encouraging me to pursue business throughout my senior year. She was surprised by my request, since I had previously talked about studying medicine, but she was enthusiastic about supporting my application to what she recognized as a prestigious and competitive program. I submitted my application on a Monday morning and received a response by Wednesday afternoon, a speed that suggested Henderson and Associates was genuinely interested in my credentials. The email invited me to participate in a phone interview the following week, with the possibility of an in-person interview if the initial conversation went well. The phone interview lasted 45 minutes and covered everything from my academic background to my thoughts on current trade relationships between the United States and Taiwan. James Henderson himself conducted the interview, asking detailed questions about my family's immigration experience and my perspective on the challenges facing Asian American entrepreneurs in the current business environment. I answered his questions with a combination of prepared talking points and genuine enthusiasm, drawing on years of dinner-table conversations about my parents' early struggles in America and my own observations about the intersection of culture and commerce. The interview felt more like an intellectual conversation than a formal evaluation, and I could sense Henderson's growing interest as we talked about specific business cases and theoretical approaches to an international expansion. The call ended with Henderson telling me that he was impressed by my knowledge and perspective, and that he would like to invite me for an in-person interview the following week. The second interview would be more comprehensive, involving meetings with several members of the Henderson and Associates team, as well as a presentation on a business case that would be provided 24 hours in advance. And I accepted the invitation immediately, already planning how I would prepare for what I understood to be the final stage of the selection process. Henderson mentioned that they typically hired only 2 interns per year, and that the decision would be made within a week of the in-person interviews. As I hung up the phone, I realized that I hadn't told my parents about my application to Henderson and Associates. They had been so focused on managing Derek's crisis and finding alternative funding for my college education that they hadn't noticed my sudden interest in internship opportunities or my absence during the time I had spent preparing my application materials. Derek, meanwhile, had been making a show of recommitment to his education and career goals, attending Narcotics Anonymous meetings and talking enthusiastically about his plans to impress Henderson and Associates. During his interview, my parents were treating his renewed focus as evidence that their sacrifice of my college fund had achieved its intended purpose, that Derek was finally ready to fulfill the potential they had always seen in him. The irony of the situation would have been amusing if it hadn't been so personally consequential. While my parents celebrated Derek's promises to get clean and build a career, I was quietly pursuing the opportunity they had spent years preparing him for, using skills and knowledge that I had developed independently while they focused their attention on managing his various crises. I prepared for my Henderson and Associates interview with the kind of methodical intensity that had always characterized my approach to important goals. I researched every member of the team I would be meeting, studied the company's recent projects and client announcements, and practiced answers to questions about international business development until I could discuss complex topics with fluency and confidence. The business case they sent me involved developing a market entry strategy for an American technology company looking to expand into Southeast Asian markets. I spent 12 hours analyzing the political, economic, and cultural factors that would influence the company's success, creating a presentation that addressed everything from regulatory compliance to marketing strategies that would resonate with local consumers. My presentation included specific recommendations about partnership opportunities, staffing strategies, and timeline considerations, supported by research into comparable market entries that had succeeded or failed based on their attention to cultural sensitivity and local business practices. I felt confident that my analysis demonstrated both analytical rigor and practical understanding of the challenges facing American companies in international markets. The in-person interview took place on a Tuesday morning in Henderson and Associates' downtown office, a sleek space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the city skyline. I arrived 30 minutes early, wearing a navy blue suit that I had purchased specifically for the interview using money from my tutoring job, and spent the extra time reviewing my notes one final time. The interview panel consisted of James Henderson, 2 senior associates, and the current intern who would be graduating from the program at the end of the summer. They asked me to present my business case analysis first, followed by a series of questions about my presentation and my broader thoughts on international business development. My presentation went smoothly, with several panel members asking follow-up questions that suggested genuine interest in my recommendations and analytical approach. I felt particularly confident during the question and answer session, where my preparation allowed me to engage in detailed discussions about specific market conditions and strategic considerations that less prepared candidates might struggle to address. The final portion of the interview involved more personal questions about my long-term career goals, my interest in working for Henderson and Associates specifically, and my thoughts on the challenges facing young professionals in the consulting industry. I answered honestly about my passion for cross-cultural business development and my belief that consulting offered the best opportunity to work with diverse clients on complex strategic challenges. James Henderson concluded the interview by telling me that they would make their decision within a week, and that all candidates would be notified regardless of the outcome. As I left the office, I felt cautiously optimistic about my performance, but tried to manage my expectations, given the competitive nature of the program and my status as a late applicant. I received the call on Friday afternoon, just as I was finishing my shift at the tutoring center. Henderson's voice was warm and congratulatory as he offered me one of the 2 internship positions. Explaining that the panel had been unanimous in their assessment that I was an exceptional candidate who would bring valuable perspective and skills to their team. The internship would begin the following Monday and run through the end of the summer, with the possibility of extension into the fall semester if my performance met their expectations. The position included a modest stipend that would help offset some of my college expenses, along with mentorship opportunities and exposure to high-level client work that could significantly enhance my resume. Professional network. I accepted the offer immediately, trying to keep my voice professional despite the excitement and relief flooding through me. This internship represented not just a career opportunity but validation that I could compete successfully for the kind of positions that my parents had reserved for Derek. That my qualifications and work ethic could open doors regardless of my family's expectations about my role in our household hierarchy. The weekend before my internship began, I finally told my parents about my new position at Henderson and Associates. I chose my moment carefully, waiting until Derek was out of the house, so that I could gauge their initial reaction without his presence complicating the conversation. My mother's first response was confusion rather than congratulation. "But that's Derek's internship," she said, as if Henderson and Associates was somehow obligated to reserve positions for specific applicants rather than selecting the most qualified candidates from their applicant pool. My father's reaction was more nuanced, combining pride in my achievement with concern about how Derek would respond to what he would inevitably see as a betrayal rather than fair competition. "Derek has been preparing for this opportunity for years," he said. "He's counting on this internship to help him get back on track." I explained that Henderson and Associates was not aware of any connection between Derek and me, that I had applied using my own credentials and had been selected based on my qualifications rather than any inside information or family connections. The position was not Derek's to lose because it had never been his to begin with. It was simply an opportunity that we had both pursued and that I had been awarded based on merit. The conversation grew more heated as my parents struggled to reconcile their pride in my success with their concern about Derek's reaction and their lingering belief that the internship had somehow been designated for him through their relationship with James Henderson. They seemed unable to accept that their careful cultivation of Derek's candidacy had been irrelevant in the face of his poor academic performance and lack of genuine interest in the field. Derek's reaction, when he finally learned about my internship, was exactly as explosive as I had expected. He accused me of stealing an opportunity that belonged to him, of deliberately sabotaging his recovery by pursuing a position that my parents had helped him prepare for over multiple years. His anger was raw and immediate, fueled by the realization that his assumed advantages in our family hierarchy were not sufficient to guarantee success in competitive external environments. "You knew I was applying for this internship," he shouted during the family confrontation that inevitably followed my announcement. "You knew how important this was to my recovery, and you went behind my back to steal it from me." I pointed out that Derek had not actually applied for the internship, that the deadline had passed months earlier while he was dealing with his drug problems, and that Henderson and Associates had no obligation to hold positions for candidates who failed to meet basic application requirements. His sense of entitlement to an opportunity he had not earned was symptomatic of the broader pattern that had led to his current problems. The argument escalated until my parents were forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that Derek's preparation for the Henderson and Associates internship had been largely superficial, more focused on maintaining appearances than developing genuine qualifications or interest in the field. His grades were too low, his knowledge of the industry too shallow, and his commitment to professional development too inconsistent to make him a competitive candidate for a prestigious program. My parents' discomfort with this realization was visible in their reluctance to fully celebrate my achievement. Their continued focus on managing Derek's emotional response rather than acknowledging that I had succeeded in a competitive process, but he had failed to even complete. The pattern of prioritizing Derek's feelings over my accomplishments was so ingrained that they seemed unable to recognize it even when it was pointed out explicitly. I started my internship at Henderson and Associates the following Monday with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, unsure how the family drama would affect my ability to focus on the professional opportunity had worked so hard to secure. The office environment was demanding but supportive, with clear expectations for intern contributions and structured mentorship designed to maximize learning opportunities. My first week involved orientation activities, training on the company's research methodologies, and initial assignments that allowed me to demonstrate my analytical skills while learning their approach to client consulting. I was paired with Sarah Kim, a senior associate who had joined Henderson and Associates 3 years earlier after completing her MBA at Wharton, and who had built a reputation for innovative approaches to market analysis and strategic planning. Sarah became both a mentor and an advocate, providing guidance on everything from professional communication to strategic thinking, while creating opportunities for me to contribute to client projects in meaningful ways. She seemed to recognize my potential early in our working relationship and invested time in developing my skills that went beyond the standard intern experience. The work itself exceeded my expectations in terms of both complexity and impact. Rather than being relegated to basic research tasks, I was assigned to support analysis on actual client engagements, contributing to reports and presentations that would influence major business decisions for companies seeking to expand into new markets. My background in tutoring recent immigrants provided unexpected value in these assignments, as my understanding of cultural barriers and communication challenges helped me identify potential obstacles that might not be obvious to consultants without similar experience. I found myself contributing insights about consumer behavior and market dynamics that enhanced the team's overall analysis and recommendations. 3 weeks into my internship, James Henderson approached me about participating in a client presentation for a major technology company considering expansion into Taiwan. The client had specifically requested that someone with cultural knowledge of the target market be included in the presentation team, and Henderson thought my background made me an ideal contributor to the discussion. The presentation required me to analyze market conditions in Taiwan's technology sector, assess potential partnership opportunities with local companies, and provide recommendations about marketing strategies that would resonate with Taiwanese consumers. I spent 2 weeks preparing for the presentation, working closely with Sarah and other team members to ensure that my analysis integrated seamlessly with their broader strategic recommendations. The client presentation went exceptionally well. with the technology company's executive team asking detailed follow-up questions about my analysis and expressing particular interest in my recommendations about cultural sensitivity in their marketing approach. They ultimately decided to proceed with their Taiwan expansion using several of the strategies I had proposed, a validation of my analytical capabilities that exceeded anything I had hoped to achieve during my internship. James Henderson's feedback after the presentation was overwhelmingly positive, and he mentioned the possibility of extending my internship through the fall semester to support the implementation of the Taiwan project. The opportunity to continue working at Henderson & Associates while deferring my college enrollment was exactly the kind of professional development experience that could accelerate my career in ways that would more than compensate for a delayed start to my undergraduate education. I was considering this possibility when Derek finally scheduled his interview at Henderson & Associates, apparently unaware that I was already working there. My parents had been encouraging him to follow through on his application despite his missed deadline, operating under the assumption that their relationship with James Henderson would create opportunities for late submission that wouldn't be available to other candidates. Derek's interview was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, during a week when I was particularly busy supporting client work that required my presence in the office for extended hours. I had been working late most evenings, staying until 7 or 8 o'clock, to complete analysis and prepare materials for upcoming presentations. On the day of Derek's interview, I was in the office conference room preparing presentation materials when I heard familiar voices in the reception area. Through the glass partition that separated the conference room from the waiting area, I could see Derek sitting nervously in one of the chairs, occasionally checking his phone and adjusting his tie in the way he did when he was anxious about performing well in evaluative situations. He looked healthier than he had in months, clearly making an effort to present himself professionally, despite his lack of preparation for the interview itself. His suit was well-fitted and his appearance was polished, evidence that my parents had invested in his presentation, even if they hadn't been able to address his underlying qualifications for the position. I continued working on my presentation materials, aware that Derek's interview was scheduled to begin shortly, but focused on completing the client work that was my primary responsibility. The irony of the situation was not lost on me, but I tried to maintain professional detachment from the family drama that had led to this moment. James Henderson emerged from his office a few minutes before Derek's scheduled interview time, walking toward the reception area to collect his candidate. As he passed the conference room where I was working, he noticed me through the glass and stopped to check on my progress with the Taiwan project materials. "Jade," he said, opening the conference room door. "How are the market analysis slides coming along? We'll need them for tomorrow's follow-up call with the client." I updated him on my progress and mentioned that I expected to have the slides completed within the hour, well in advance of the scheduled client call. Our conversation was brief and professional, focused on project logistics rather than personal matters, but it occurred in full view of the reception area where Derek was waiting for his interview. I could see Derek's face change as he processed what he was seeing, the realization that I was not just visiting Henderson & Associates, but was clearly established there as a working member of the team. His confusion was visible in his expression, followed quickly by what looked like dawning understanding of the implications of my presence in the office. Henderson concluded our brief conversation and continued toward the reception area, where he greeted Derek with the kind of professional courtesy he showed to all interview candidates. I watched through the glass partition as they shook hands, and Henderson invited Derek to follow him to the interview room, both of them maintaining the formal politeness that characterizes professional interactions. The interview lasted approximately 30 minutes, during which I continued working on my presentation materials while remaining aware of the ongoing conversation in Henderson's office. I could not hear the specific content of their discussion, but I could see Derek's animated gestures through the office windows, and Henderson's more measured responses to whatever points Derek was trying to make. When the interview concluded, Henderson walked Derek back to the reception area and thanked him for his time with the same professional courtesy he had shown at the beginning of their meeting. Derek shook his hand and headed toward the elevator, but instead of leaving immediately, he diverted toward the conference room where I was working. "Jade," he said, opening the conference room door without waiting for permission. "What the hell are you doing here?" I looked up from my laptop where I had been formatting the market analysis slides, meeting Derek's angry stare with what I hoped was professional composure, despite the personal tension of the situation. "I work here," I said simply. "I'm a summer intern with Henderson and Associates." Derek's face went through several emotional transitions as he processed this information, beginning with disbelief and moving quickly through anger towards something that looked like devastation. "You can't work here," he said, as if my employment was somehow subject to his approval. "This is my internship. I've been preparing for this for years." I explained that Henderson and Associates had selected me based on my qualifications and interview performance, that I had applied through standard channels and had been awarded the position through competitive evaluation rather than any inside influence or family connections. The internship had never belonged to Derek simply because our parents had encouraged him to prepare for it. "But you knew I was applying here," Derek said, his voice rising in a way that was attracting attention from other employees in the office. "You knew how important this was to me, and you deliberately tried to sabotage my chances." I pointed out that Derek had not actually applied for the internship, that he had missed the deadline while dealing with his drug problems, and that my application had been submitted and evaluated independently of any knowledge about his intentions. Henderson and Associates had no obligation to consider candidates who failed to meet basic application requirements, regardless of their family connections or personal circumstances. The conversation was interrupted by James Henderson, who appeared in the conference room doorway with an expression that suggested he had overheard enough of our discussion to understand the family dynamic that was playing out. In his office. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, directing his question primarily toward me, while maintaining awareness of Derek's obvious agitation. I apologized for the disruption and explained that Derek was my brother, and that there had been some confusion about my employment at Henderson and Associates. I assured Henderson that the family situation would not interfere with my work performance, and that I would handle any personal issues outside of office hours and office premises. Derek looked back and forth between Henderson and me, clearly realizing that his behavior was undermining whatever impression he had made during his interview, and that his relationship to me was not going to provide him with any advantage in the selection process. He apologized for the disruption and left the office quickly, leaving Henderson and me to address the awkwardness of the situation. "I didn't realize you had a brother who was also interested in interning here," Henderson said, his tone carefully neutral, but his expression suggesting that Derek's behavior had not made a positive impression. "Is this going to create any complications for your work here?" I assured him that my family situation would not affect my professional performance, and that I was committed to maintaining appropriate boundaries between personal and professional responsibilities. Henderson seemed satisfied with this response. But I could sense that Derek's interview had not gone well, and that his confrontational behavior in the office had likely eliminated any possibility of his being selected for a future internship opportunity. That evening, I arrived home to find my parents waiting for me in the living room with expressions that suggested Derek had already provided his version of the day's events. Their disappointment was immediately apparent, not in Derek's poor interview performance or inappropriate behavior, but in my decision to pursue the internship without consulting them about potential conflicts with Derek's plans. "Jade," my mother began, her voice carrying the same tone of disappointment that she had used when I was a child, and had broken some important household rule. "Derek told us what happened at his interview today. How could you not tell us that you were working at Henderson and Associates?" I explained that I had told them about my internship the previous week, and that their focus on Derek's emotional response had prevented them from fully processing the information I had provided. I had not deliberately concealed my employment, but I had also not anticipated that Derek would schedule an interview without completing the application process or meeting basic eligibility requirements. My father's response was more focused on the practical implications of the situation. "This makes our family look unprofessional," he said. "James Henderson is an important contact for our community, and having family drama play out in his office reflects poorly on all of us. I acknowledged that Derek's behavior had been inappropriate and potentially embarrassing. But I pointed out that my own professional performance had been consistently excellent and that Henderson had expressed satisfaction with my contributions to client work. The family drama was Derek's creation, not mine, and I should not be held responsible for managing his reactions to consequences of his own choices. The conversation continued for over an hour. With my parents struggling to reconcile their pride in my professional success with their concern about Derek's emotional well-being, their embarrassment about the family conflict playing out in a professional context that was important to their social and business networks. Derek joined the conversation midway through, having apparently spent the afternoon processing his humiliation and developing talking points about how my actions had undermined his recovery and damaged his prospects for rebuilding his life. His arguments were emotionally manipulative, designed to frame my success as selfish betrayal rather than legitimate achievement earned through merit and hard work. Jade knew how important this internship was to my recovery, Derek told our parents, repeating the theme he had emphasized earlier in the day. She deliberately applied for the position to hurt me, to sabotage my chances of getting my life back on track. I responded that Derek's recovery was his own responsibility, not something that depended on receiving unearned professional opportunities or having family members sacrifice their own goals to accommodate his poor choices. The internship was not therapy, and Henderson and Associates was not obligated to provide employment to people who needed professional validation for psychological reasons. The argument escalated until my father finally imposed a temporary ceasefire, insisting that we all needed time to cool down before we could have a productive discussion about how to move forward. But it was clear that my parents remained uncomfortable with the situation, still hoping to find some way to manage Derek's disappointment while maintaining the family harmony that had been disrupted by the collision between merit-based selection and their expectations about favoritism. I continued my internship at Henderson and Associates throughout this family turmoil, determined not to let personal drama undermine the professional opportunity I had earned through my qualifications and interview. Performance. My work on the Taiwan project continued to receive positive feedback, and James Henderson ultimately offered to extend my internship through the fall semester with increased responsibilities and the possibility of client-facing work. The extended internship meant deferring my enrollment at Northwestern for a full year, a decision that felt both risky and strategically sound given the career advancement opportunities that Henderson and Associates was offering. The practical experience I was gaining, combined with the professional network I was building, seemed likely to enhance my eventual college experience and post-graduation career prospects in ways that would justify the delayed start to my undergraduate education. My parents' reaction to the internship extension was complicated, combining pride in my professional recognition with continued concern about the impact on Derek and on family relationships that had been strained by the summer's events. They seemed unable to fully celebrate my success, while Derek remained unemployed and struggling with the reality that his assumed advantages had not translated into actual opportunities. Derek's reaction to my extended internship was predictably bitter, framing my success as evidence of systemic unfairness, rather than recognition that his own lack of preparation and poor choices had eliminated opportunities that had never been guaranteed to him. He continued to struggle with sobriety and employment, patterns that suggested his problems ran deeper than the specific disappointment of not receiving the Henderson and Associates internship. As fall approached, I found myself in the unprecedented position of being the family success story. The child whose hard work and strategic thinking had produced tangible career advancement despite the family's financial crisis and Derek's ongoing problems. The role reversal was both satisfying and isolating, as my parents struggled to adjust their expectations, and Derek remained resentful of what he perceived as undeserved advantages that had somehow been redirected from him to me. The Henderson and Associates internship became a launching pad for opportunities that exceeded anything I had imagined when I first applied for the position. My work on the Taiwan project led to additional client assignments, speaking opportunities at industry conferences, and recommendations that helped me secure admission to business school programs that were even more prestigious than Northwestern. By the end of my extended internship, James Henderson had offered me a full-time position as a junior associate, with the understanding that I would eventually pursue an MBA while working part-time for the firm. The arrangement would allow me to earn a salary while completing my undergraduate and graduate education, eliminating the student debt burden that would have defined my financial future if I had proceeded with my original college plans. The transformation of my circumstances felt almost surreal compared to the devastation I had experienced when my parents first told me about Derek's appropriation of my college fund. What had seemed like the destruction of my carefully planned future had instead become the catalyst for opportunities that were far superior to anything I had originally envisioned for myself. Derek's trajectory during this same period moved in exactly the opposite direction. His failure to secure the Henderson and Associates internship had been followed by a series of similar disappointments as he applied for positions without the credentials or preparation necessary to compete successfully. His brief period of sobriety ended after his interview disaster, and he returned to the same destructive patterns that had created the original crisis. My parents' response to these parallel developments revealed the depth of their investment in maintaining family myths that no longer corresponded to reality. They continued to make excuses for Derek's failures while treating my success as somehow accidental or temporary. As if acknowledging the merit-based nature of my achievements would require them to confront uncomfortable truths about favoritism and enabling that had shaped our family dynamics for years. The annual family dinner, where we typically discussed major life updates, became a tense affair marked by careful avoidance of topics that might highlight the contrast between Derek's continued struggles and my accelerating career success. My parents had developed elaborate strategies for steering conversations away from my professional accomplishments while emphasizing Derek's minimal progress in addiction recovery as if sobriety alone represented achievement worthy of celebration. During one particularly awkward dinner conversation, my mother suggested that I should consider sharing some of my Henderson and Associates salary with Derek to help him get back on his feet financially. The request was presented as temporary assistance rather than ongoing support. But the underlying assumption that my earnings were somehow family resources to be redistributed according to need rather than merit revealed how little my parents understood about personal responsibility, professional achievement. I declined this request firmly but politely, explaining that my salary was compensation for work performance and professional contributions rather than family wealth to be shared according to emotional or psychological need. Derek's financial problems were consequences of his own choices, and providing him with unearned money would simply enable continued irresponsibility, while undermining the connection between effort and reward that was essential to any meaningful recovery. The conversation revealed fundamental disagreements about personal responsibility, family obligations, and the relationship between individual achievement and collective support that had been lurking beneath the surface of our family interactions for years. My parents' approach to Derek's problems had always prioritized short-term crisis management over long-term behavior change, a strategy that had consistently failed to produce sustainable improvement in his circumstances. My refusal to subsidize Derek's lifestyle with my Henderson and Associates earnings created new tension in our family relationships, but it also established boundaries that I should have set years earlier. The pattern of sacrificing my interests to accommodate Derek's problems had been broken by circumstances rather than choice, but maintaining those boundaries was an active decision that required ongoing commitment. As my second year at Henderson and Associates began, I found myself taking on increasingly sophisticated client work and developing expertise in cross-cultural business development that was becoming recognized within the industry. My analysis of Asian markets had been cited in several published reports, and I had been invited to speak at conferences about strategies for American companies seeking to expand internationally. The professional recognition I was receiving felt validating in ways that went beyond simple career advancement. The skills and perspectives that I had developed through my family's immigration experience and my own multicultural identity were proving valuable in business contexts that my parents had never imagined when they focused their attention on preparing Derek for conventional success. James Henderson had become something of a mentor, providing guidance not just on specific projects but on long-term career strategy and professional development. His willingness to invest in my growth contrasted sharply with my parents' continued focus on managing Derek's crises, and I began to understand how much my potential had been constrained by family dynamics that prioritized emotional management over individual achievement. The opportunity to pursue my undergraduate degree while working at Henderson and Associates emerged when James learned about Northwestern's evening program for working professionals. The program would allow me to complete my business degree over 3 years while maintaining my full-time position, with Henderson and Associates providing tuition assistance as part of their employee development benefits. This arrangement was financially superior to my original college plans in every way. Instead of accumulating debt while attending school full-time, I would be earning a salary while completing my education with minimal student loans. Instead of graduating with theoretical knowledge and limited practical experience, I would have 4 years of professional experience with a respected consulting firm by the time I received my degree. My parents' reaction to this opportunity was characteristically complicated, combining pride in my achievement with continued concern about Derek's emotional response to my continued success. They seemed unable to celebrate my good fortune without simultaneously worrying about how it would affect Derek's self-esteem and recovery prospects. Derek's reaction was predictably resentful, focused on the unfairness of my receiving educational and professional opportunities that he felt should have been his by virtue of birth order and parental investment. His inability to recognize the connection between his poor choices and his limited opportunities was symptomatic of the broader entitlement that had contributed to his addiction and employment problems. The family dynamics that emerged from these developments felt like a fundamental shift in our household hierarchy. With my parents forced to acknowledge that their investment in Derek's potential had not produced the returns they had expected, while their neglect of my capabilities had failed to prevent me from achieving success independently. This recognition was uncomfortable for everyone involved, but it was particularly difficult for my parents, who had built their identity as successful immigrants around their ability to guide their children toward achievement that would validate their sacrifices and planning. Derek's failures challenged their fundamental beliefs about parenting and success, while my independent achievement suggested that their guidance had been less essential than they had believed. As I settled into my routine of working full-time while attending evening classes, I found myself developing friendships and professional relationships that were independent of my family's social networks and expectations. My colleagues at Henderson and Associates treated me as a peer rather than as someone's daughter, and my classmates in the evening program were similarly focused on individual achievement rather than family obligations. These relationships provided perspective on family dynamics that I had previously accepted as normal, but that I was beginning to recognize as dysfunctional. Other families seemed to celebrate individual achievement without the complex emotional calculations that characterized my parents' response to success. And other siblings seemed capable of supporting each other's goals without the resentment and competition that defined my relationship with Derek. The contrast was particularly stark when I attended Henderson and Associates social events with colleagues who talked enthusiastically about their siblings' achievements in various fields. Their pride in family member success seemed uncomplicated by concerns about fairness or emotional management, and their support for each other's goals appeared to strengthen rather than strain their relationships. I began to understand that my family's approach to achievement and support was not inevitable or natural, but was instead a pattern that had developed in response to Derek's problems and my parents' anxiety about managing his emotional needs. The dysfunction was not permanent or unchangeable. but addressing it would require acknowledgement of problems that my parents seemed determined to avoid confronting. My success at Henderson & Associates continued to accelerate throughout my second year with the firm, as my expertise in cross-cultural business development became increasingly valuable to clients seeking to expand into Asian markets. I was promoted to senior associate after 18 months, a advancement that typically required 3 to 4 years of experience, but that reflected my contributions to major client projects. The promotion came with a substantial salary increase and additional responsibilities that positioned me for eventual partnership track consideration. Opportunities that exceeded anything I had imagined when I first applied for the internship position. My career trajectory was accelerating in ways that would have been impossible if I had followed my original plan of attending Northwestern immediately after high school. Derek's circumstances during this same period continued to deteriorate, as his inability to maintain steady employment or sobriety created ongoing financial and legal problems that required increasingly expensive interventions from my parents. They had spent thousands of dollars on rehabilitation programs, legal fees, and emergency assistance that had produced only temporary improvements, followed by relapses into the same destructive patterns. The contrast between our trajectories had become impossible to ignore, even for parents who had invested years in maintaining the fiction that Derek's potential was simply temporarily obstructed by circumstances beyond his control. My achievements were concrete and measurable, while Derek's progress remained hypothetical and dependent on promises that he had repeatedly failed to keep. Family gatherings became increasingly strained as my parents struggled to balance their pride in my success with their ongoing concern for Talben, Derek's well-being, and their embarrassment about the choices they had made in redistributing resources from my college fund to his drug debts. The decision that had seemed justified by crisis now appeared short-sighted and unfair, particularly given the obvious differences in how Derek and I had responded to our respective opportunities and challenges. During one particularly tense family dinner, Derek finally acknowledged the reality that everyone had been avoiding discussing directly. "I screwed up," he said, his voice carrying a level of honesty that had been absent from our family conversations for years. "Jade earned everything she got, and I threw away everything I was given." The admission was significant, not just because it represented Derek's first honest assessment of our comparative circumstances, but because it forced my parents to confront the uncomfortable truth that their favoritism and enabling had not helped Derek, while their neglect had not hindered my ability to achieve success through merit and hard work. My mother's response revealed the depth of her investment in maintaining family myths that no longer corresponded to reality. "Derek, you're being too hard on yourself," she said, even as the evidence of his continued poor choices accumulated around us. "You just need to find the right opportunity, the right environment to help you succeed." But Derek shook his head, rejecting the familiar pattern of externalization that had characterized his approach to personal responsibility throughout his addiction and recovery attempts. "No, Mom. Jade succeeded because she worked harder and made better choices. I failed because I was lazy and selfish and thought I deserved things I hadn't earned." The conversation that followed was the most honest discussion our family had ever had about achievement, favoritism, and personal responsibility. Derek talked about his awareness that our parents had always expected less of him while providing him with more support, and how this combination had undermined his development of genuine skills and work ethic. He acknowledged that his drug use had been a way of avoiding the anxiety and effort required for legitimate achievement, and that his anger about my Henderson & Associates internship had been misplaced resentment about losing advantages that he had never deserved, rather than legitimate grievance about unfair treatment. My parents listened to this conversation with visible discomfort, forced to confront years of parenting decisions that had been guided by emotional reactivity rather than strategic thinking about long-term character development. Their investment in protecting Derek from consequences had prevented him from developing resilience, while their assumption that I would succeed regardless of support had accidentally created conditions that fostered genuine achievement. The family meeting concluded with tentative agreements about changed expectations and boundaries going forward. Derek would be responsible for his own financial support and would not receive additional bailouts for problems created by poor choices. My achievements would be celebrated without qualification or concern about emotional impact on Derek, who acknowledged that his self-esteem should be based on his own efforts, rather than on family management of Tonker. Comparative success. These agreements represented significant progress in our family's willingness to address dysfunction that had been developing for years, but implementing them required ongoing commitment that proved challenging for parents who had built their identity around crisis management and emotional protection rather than performance-based support. Natural consequences. Over the following months, my parents struggled to maintain the boundaries they had agreed to establish, occasionally reverting to old patterns of making excuses for Derek while minimizing my achievements. But the conversation had created awareness of these patterns that made them more difficult to sustain, and Derek's own commitment to honesty about his problems provided accountability that had been missing from previous Tane. Attempts at family change. My career at Henderson & Associates continued to flourish as I completed my undergraduate degree and began considering MBA programs that would position me for eventual partnership consideration. The firm's tuition assistance program had eliminated the educational debt that would have constrained my choices, and my professional experience provided credibility that enhanced my applications to top-tier business schools. The transformation of my circumstances over 3 years felt almost miraculous compared to the devastation I had experienced when my college fund disappeared, but it also felt earned in ways that made the success meaningful rather than accidental. Every opportunity had been pursued through effort and preparation. Every advancement had been based on performance rather than favoritism, and every achievement represented genuine capability rather than inherited advantage. Derek's gradual acceptance of responsibility for his choices created space for a different kind of relationship between us, one based on mutual respect rather than competition for parental resources and attention. As he began making genuine progress in recovery and employment, his resentment about my success diminished, replaced by what seemed like authentic pride in my achievements. The internship that had begun as strategic response to family crisis had become the foundation for a career that exceeded anything I had originally imagined for myself. The sacrifice of my college fund, which had seemed like devastating betrayal, had accidentally created circumstances that forced me to pursue opportunities that were superior to my original plans in every measurable way. Looking back on the chain of events that had transformed my life trajectory, I realized that my parents' poor decision-making had accidentally taught me valuable lessons about self-reliance, merit-based achievement, and the importance of creating my own opportunities rather than depending on family resources or expectations. The crisis had revealed capabilities and resilience that might never have been tested if my original college plans had proceeded smoothly. 3 years after that devastating conversation in our living room, I was earning more money than my parents, building a career that positioned me for long-term success in international business, and developing expertise that was recognized within my industry. Derek was slowly rebuilding his life based on genuine effort rather than inherited advantages, and our family was learning to function according to healthier principles of personal responsibility and merit-based support. The transformation felt complete when James Henderson offered me a position on the partnership track, recognition that my contributions to the firm had established me as someone with long-term potential for leadership and equity ownership. The offer represented financial security that would have been impossible to achieve through conventional college and entry-level employment, validation of strategic choices that had seemed risky when I first made them. My parents' response to this opportunity was overwhelmingly positive, unmarked by the complicated emotional calculations that had characterized their reaction to my earlier achievements. They seemed to have finally accepted that my success was permanent rather than temporary, earned rather than accidental, and worthy of celebration without qualification or concern about impact on Derek. Derek's response was similarly generous, congratulating me with what appeared to be genuine happiness about my continued advancement. His own progress in recovery and employment had given him confidence that was independent of family dynamics, creating space for him to support my achievements without feeling threatened by them. The partnership track position at Henderson & Associates represented the culmination of strategic choices that had begun with my decision to pursue the internship Derek had been groomed for. But it also felt like the beginning of possibilities that extended far beyond what any of us had originally imagined. The crisis that had destroyed my original plans had instead created opportunities for achievement that were superior in every way, proving that sometimes the best response to unfair treatment is simply to outperform the people who thought they deserved better.